How's everybody feeling this morning? I hope you're enjoying yourself. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, but why don't we just take a minute to, ready ourselves for the day. So I encourage everybody to just get yourself comfortable. We won't spend long. Just close your eyes and take a deep breath in through your nose. Breathe all the way down to your belly. Breathe out of your mouth. Do that 3 times at your own pace. Seriously? All right, we switched from meditation to laughing yoga. Okay, let's get back in our Zen mode. All right, let's start. We got to start over now. So take a deep breath down to your belly, out through your mouth. And just visualize gratitude for being here and focus on your heart and think about your purpose. Thank you. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Lorenzo Cohen, who is a distinguished professor. He's the Richard E. Haynes Distinguished Professor in Clinical Cancer Prevention and the founding director in 1998 of the Integrative Medicine Program at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. Dr. Cohen is a founding member and past president of the Society for Integrative Oncology and the former vice chair of the Academic Consortium for Integrative Medicine and Health. Dr. Cohen helps lead a team conducting research and delivering clinical care of integrative medicine practices aimed at reducing the negative aspects of cancer treatment and improving quality of life and clinical outcomes. He has conducted some of the first randomized clinical trials of yoga in cancer patients, and you'll hear about some of that work and the trials and tribulations in this talk. And he continues this important research today. He's also a major connection with some of the scientists and yoga folks in India. And it's, moving on, he basically, knowing that most cancers are preventable, Dr. Cohen has led research in comprehensive lifestyle change, including healthy diet, physical activity, stress management, and social support. He was influenced by his own grandmother, who was a yoga teacher, and he also has his own yoga practice and obtained his 200-hour yoga therapy certification. Along with Dr. Payang Yang, they're conducting in-depth research now on biofield therapies, something else you will learn and hear about. Dr. Cohen has published more than 185 scientific articles in top medical journals, numerous book chapters, edited 2 books on integrative medicine for cancer care, and co-edited the book entitled The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. Dr. Cohen has also co-authored a book entitled Anti-Cancer Living, Transform Your Life and Health with the Mix of 6. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you, Lorenzo. I'm trying to find, oh, you got it? Yeah, with all of this, I think what I'd be most impressed by is if you can push that green button. So thanks.
Thank you, Santosh, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizing committee to invite me to speak here today. It's a real honor to speak in front of this audience as a keynote speaker. And Santosh asked me to talk about stress and cancer. So the initial focus of the talk was that. Everyone here knows about the harms of stress and the benefits of stress management. So I asked permission and was encouraged by Dr. Rao to take this in a slightly different direction. But I'm going to start with some history as to some of these practices, show a bit of a roadmap of how I got to where I am today, overwhelm you with the evidence which you already have in your knowledge base now. And then, as Santosh mentioned, go into this area of biofield and explain a little bit of what that is. Here we go with the clicker. It shouldn't be rocket science. So just as disclosure, Dr. Rao mentioned this book that I co-wrote with my wife, Allison Jeffries, who's soon to be a graduate of actually Andy Weil's program to be a wellness coach. Look forward to that next iteration in her life. When we focus in the book to provide the evidence base for cancer patients on, first and foremost, of course, how to prevent cancer, but then these 6 pillars that you're all familiar with, but unfortunately, within our organizations, research-wise, we tend to dismantle. We tend to not look at it in a comprehensive fashion. And I'll come back to that near the end, because I think with a lot of the ongoing research where we look at 1 or 2 or even 3 of these pillars, we're often going to fall short. And the area we're going to go deep in today is the area of stress management, the challenges of stress in our lives. And that, I think, is one of the most challenging areas that is not discussed enough with our patients when we're trying to get them to eat a healthy diet, exercise, and lose weight. We tend to not really focus on that area. So let's go back in time a bit. If this screen could be turned on, that would be super helpful. Back to the origins of some of these practices. And let's go back even further. And in doing research for this talk, I actually came across what originally came up as this Tibetan Buddhist cave. But what was found in this cave actually goes back even further, as you can see pictured there, 160,000 years ago. They found these pre-humans, our ancestors that evolved into Homo sapien. Remnants were found in the cave. So one of the questions is, what were these humanoids doing up there on the high Tibetan plateau in a cave? We can speculate, and of course, no one is going there in terms of that. What we do know, if we flash forward a little bit further in time, but still back in the Neolithic period, was this discovery in Turkey of what is regarded as one of the first organized religious sites that has been discovered. And you can see there the date for this. And why this is really interesting is that, evolutionarily speaking, when we look at from 200,000 years ago to our appearance, let's say, to the formation of cities, they've often looked at agriculture as a main focus, and that there was this very linear trajectory, and that this is not really malleable. The formation of cities, the agriculture meant that there's a formation of city. Formation of city means that there's politics, increased politics, we're destroying the planet. And there's evidence now from a couple of British scholars, one American, one Brit, but they're both living in Britain. I think the book is entitled The History of Everything, essentially turning that hypothesis on its head. And the discovery of this site is one of the reasons. And it's because even back at that time, there were large organizations formed, but this was pre-agriculture. And the hypothesis that's being posited is that perhaps it was religion and these organized, what they're calling prehistoric religions could have been what was the catalyst, because the cities hadn't fully formed yet and neither had agriculture. More recently, of course, there's Buddhism and remnants of Buddhist practices, in particular in India, which was the origins of Buddhism. And then this is more recently, however, a much more ancient religion. And some say that Hinduism is the oldest continuously practiced to this day religion in the world. Now, we're going to shift and we're going to talk about yoga. There is evidence of yogic practices dating back quite some time. Here you see 1500 BCE, this individual that you could consider is in a yogic pose. However, a lot of the writings from the Upanishads and the Vedas that predate that didn't necessarily talk about asana. And the other thing about Hinduism, why there isn't a lot of archaeological remains, is because a lot of it was built in wood. And so, of course, wood does not last the ages as would a cave or other non-biodegradable substances. So what is the definition of some of these mind-body practices? You see here, courtesy of Raghuram from the Vyasa group in Bangalore, a number of different definitions. The one that I love the most, and we'll come back to this at the end, is joining the individual soul to the universal soul. We're more familiar with Patanjali and the Patanjali Yoga Sutras that you see pictured here, controlling the disturbances of the mind. So ultimately, it had to do with the person, it had to do with the self. If we look to some of the Tibetan practices, we see that Neljor, this concept of Tibetan yoga, to practice to understand primordial wisdom. The real meaning of yoga is we discover our real condition. So there is a lot of history behind what it is that we call these mind-body practices. And it's important to look to that history as we try and move this forward to see what is the true application for us. This is a quote from my book, where humans on every part of the planet have found ways to focus inward on oneself, on one's connection to others, to a higher power, and ultimately to the world as a whole and our place in it. So we're going to take a little detour now to my origins and what brought this to me. I was born in Italy, half Italian side, half American side. But it was the Italian side that was very deep and strong within me. Every summer, literally for the whole summer from the time I was born, we would go to Italy, spend time there, and was very influenced by my grandmother, who you see pictured here, Vanda Scaravelli, who became a yogini later in life. She didn't start her yoga practice until she was in her 50s or so, and then practiced up until the time of her death, literally the morning that she had a massive cerebral hemorrhage. She was doing yoga that morning. She always said that she had three masters, three teachers, one for the head, the mind, one for the body, and one for the breath. She was very close friends with Krishnamurti, who you see pictured here, an Indian philosopher. They had a very deep correspondence her whole life, literally writing each other on a daily basis. When the pad was filled, Krishnamurti would send the whole pad to her, and she would host him when he came to Italy, and then in summers in Switzerland when he spoke at Sanan for many years. For the body, it was BKS Iyengar, who many of you are familiar with, a very physical yoga, certainly back then, until he was in his later years, where he brought in a bit more of the calmer meditative components, let's say, and that's Vanda on the left with BKS Iyengar doing a pose on top of her. And then for the breath, it was Desikachar. And those of you who know this yoga lineage know that he really was the master of pranayama. Krishnamacharya is at the top of this lineage as the teacher of both of those individuals. And so this is the house that I grew up in between graduate and undergraduate and graduate school. I lived for a year in Italy with my grandmother, learning from her, taking yoga lessons literally every day before she would welcome her one-on-one student, which was the only way that she taught. And even prior to this, I knew that there was something a little weird about grandma. She was not the average grandmother. And she would, when I was younger, in particular, when we had friends at the farm, she would play this game with us, which she would call playing with gravity. One aspect of her practice was essentially rooting to, she would just say that it's using gravity, let gravity do its thing. I think now we can think of it because we know what gravity is from a physics perspective. It has to do with energy, right? It's this energetic force. And she was using this energetic force as part of her yoga practice, but she never talked about it from that more Eastern perspective. It was really from this practical perspective of what she felt. And she would root herself down and just stand there and do a deep exhalation and challenge anyone or any number of people. And we tried this with a number of people to try and lift her off the ground. And you can see that she barely weighs 100 pounds. It was impossible to lift her off the ground. She would extend her arm out and just kind of let the gravity flow through her and said, try and bend my arm. Literally impossible to bend her arm. We never tested it with this individual who's the strongest man in the world, but theoretically he would not be able to lift this small woman off the ground. As a side note, this guy's a vegan, so those who think you can't, build muscle without animal protein, well, you're wrong. So, Vanda said that these were just, games and that there was, a very serious component to what this means when you're able to connect to this energy, this literally universal energy that was created back in time that exists around this planet. Krishnamurti, in his later years, became very, very close friends with Dr. David Bohm. They've written books together. They have these deep discussions. Dr. Bohm is one of the fathers of quantum physics, concepts of entanglement, and we'll come back to this. But their discussions talked a lot about time and past, present, and future. And this was a very important component of Krishnamurti's philosophy. And here you see this quote from Albert Einstein, who also is putting forward this concept that, time is of our own creation. And we think of something in the past having happened and something in the future hasn't happened yet. But we've created that. Now, I have a really hard time understanding that concept, but Einstein understood this. And I think it's in some sense, as you'll see, incumbent upon us to try and understand this further. During that time when I was with my grandmother, and subsequently I took many trips to India, kind of wandering around, finding, purpose, meaning, exploring. And as those of you who have been to India know, there's some very interesting people in India doing some things that in some sense defy logic. I spent a lot of time up in the Himalayas in Varanasi, and there are, I'm sure there's many people in this room who have met people who have demonstrated things that defy basic scientific logic of how we think the world should work. But let's shift back into science and to some of the early work trying to document yoga and the physiological benefits of yoga. Kavaladharma is one of the areas that they did a lot of this research, and you see that pictured here. was Swami Kuvalandanandana, who really tried to document the physiological benefits of yoga. A lot of this is not in the Western literature and is published in the Indian journals of physiology. But this was going on long before the hippie movement, long before we in the West started to have an interest in yoga, trying to scientifically document what was going on. Where it really hit front page literally news was the work of Herb Benson from Harvard, where he had heard about these individuals through deep meditation, these Tibetan monks using Tummo meditation practice, that they could modify physiological processes in their body. And you can see here, this was published in Nature, where he was able to document that through volition, through individual consciousness, that these monks could change their heart rate, their blood pressure, and temperature in different parts of their body. They could literally move this energy from one part of the body to other parts of the body. And he was able to scientifically document this through Western scientific technique. Another really seminal paper, and hopefully you're all familiar with it, is this paper by Richie Davidson collaborating with Jon Kabat-Zinn, where they took novice meditators, put them through what is become known as MBSR, 8-week program, and they found, not surprisingly, decrease in anxiety from before to after. There was a control group, but more importantly, they were measuring brain activity as well as response to vaccination. So an indirect measure of immune function, and showing this high correlation between tighter vaccine response and changes in the brain. Richie has said, and some of you have heard, he doesn't quite know why this article got so much attention, because if you look at the details, it was like an N of 80, a very small sample size, hasn't been replicated. But I think people wanted to be pushed. People wanted to look at the potential that this could really create change. Just after that, we published our paper, one of the first as an RCT in oncology, with a formal control group showing the benefits of yoga for sleep. And since then, there has been just a plethora of research in this area. And one of the reasons is because we know about the harms of stress. So I was trained as a stress researcher, and early on when I got to MD Anderson setting up studies to measure the harms of stress, it became clear that we had to look to see how we could intervene on this. Here you see an example of, at the time of diagnosis, all advanced stage patients, that depression was a potent predictor of survival. We were able to look at gene expression pathways along with Steve Cole, who many in this room collaborate with, and even get into the tumor microenvironment and see increased infiltration of macrophages. And we'll come back to that later in the talk. Similarly, in a bladder cancer cohort, where there's this increased risk if a patient has a history of depression and they're experiencing current depression, where they have much shorter survival. And in this study, we're able to look at telomere length. More depression, shorter telomeres, that combination is tragic for the individuals, and you see those survival curves. So the key is to intervene. Those who want an update on this, somebody whose research I was exposed to actually as a graduate student who is continuing to move in this direction, Ben Eliyahu, published his most recent review of essentially stress, sympathetic nervous system activation, and cancer. And what's interesting, taking this to the next level from prior reviews, is this feedback that exists that everyone in this room is familiar with. And the key, of course, is to break that cycle. And where he has started to take this is actually looking at pharmacological interventions, which of course, there's nothing wrong with trying things like beta blockers, but ideal we're doing behavioral interventions. And we're not just making patients feel better. Theoretically, we're going to be making changes literally down into the tumor microenvironment, because we know that stress will activate all the cancer hallmarks. It's not just one or two. Stress activates all the cancer hallmarks. It leads to immune suppression. It leads to DNA damage. It leads to increased angiogenesis. This is something, of course, that we need to turn off. And we're starting to know how to do that. And here's just some examples from our laboratory, from my group, from Catherine Milbury, who's here, both with the caregivers, the patients, Tibetan practices, Indian-based practices, multiple cancer populations. And of course, we're not the only ones doing this yoga research. There are many around the country, around the world, and looking at the biological basis for this. Here you see this trajectory over time up to 2017, a review that I published with Suzanne Danhauer and others, where there has just been this mass of research that has expanded specifically in yoga. If we look to meditation, we see MBSR in particular, MBCT. Linda Carlson's work has just been monumental in starting this a number of years ago and focusing specifically to modify MBSR for a cancer population. These are just a few examples from the literature, and the list goes on. This, to me, was an extremely impressive study of Linda's, showing essentially MBSR would buffer telomere suppression. Essentially, she's showing that we can slow the aging process with this type of a mind-body practice. I don't think our colleagues in medical oncology are aware of this level of evidence that exists. But the biology behind this is very clear now. And again, we go all the way down into gene expression profiles, which is the key. And so, you know, we've come to the point, certainly with mind-body practices, you see here in this review led by Jun Mao, yoga, meditation, MBSR, I mean, all the boxes are checked between those two practices. And there's other mind-body practices, of course, as well. And here you see symptoms, but in some sense, the next step would be to understand more deeply what is actually going on here. I would say our work is done as it relates to getting the evidence behind these mind-body practices. They're on the guidelines. The key now is to figure out how to navigate institutions politically, how to get policymakers to reimburse this, because if it's on the guidelines, they should pay for it. We shouldn't have two standards of medicine, one that you personally believe and then the other one that is paid for. It should all be paid for if it's on the guidelines. That hasn't happened yet. Things like acupuncture in the United States, at least, is really spotty. Some states, even within the same insurance companies, reimburse it fully. Other states like Texas, Blue Cross Blue Shield, they don't. But other insurance companies, they do. Yoga, nothing. It doesn't even appear. And look at the evidence for yoga. These are the NCCN guidelines. So I really think we need to move on to, in some sense, dissemination, policy, taking the next step. And the SIO, I think, can go there. And I think that people throughout this pandemic time have started to realize this even more. He's saying, I've had a lot of free time this year doing a very advanced Bakasana. What we haven't often measured is some of these concepts that are harder to measure from a qualitative perspective and certainly from a quantitative perspective. I know that with things like HRV, we're looking at HRV coherence between two individuals and and things like connection. But we haven't gone deep enough. We certainly haven't measured concepts like consciousness. People feel more connected after doing a yoga practice for an extended period of time. They find more meaning and purpose in life. And how do you measure that beyond these Likert scales, which of course we give to patients? And this brings me back to this concept that we put forward in Anti-Cancer Living, which is this concept of the synergy between the parts. I fear that with a lot of the lifestyle research we're supporting in the country and the world, that we will somehow fall short if we don't include this area of stress, love and support, connection, meaning and purpose. Sure, women are going to lose weight, men will lose weight, they'll get more fit. But if they're leading chronically stressed lives that are devoid of meaning and purpose, a lot of those changes not only will be short-lived, but you're continuing to fuel the body with norepinephrine as one example of a very damaging stress hormone. So the beneficial effects of everything that we're prescribing will ultimately be sabotaged. And we've been doing comprehensive research using this more, let's call it, intensive model. And in exit interviews, and we published some qualitative research in this area, very consistently, the women were sharing that the mind-body component was not only so new to them, but so important, so critical in allowing them to stay the course. And one woman in particular who really was struggling and came from a disadvantaged background said, I don't know if anyone has felt like this in their lives, to have so many questions, but they're trapped within you and unable to get them out. And she said, through meditation and deep relaxation, my answers are now flowing. I've never been more connected to myself than before joining the study. This is really the true transformations that we're looking for. Now let's go back to gravity and back to what I was exposed to with Vanda and her exposures in her life. I learned relatively recently that Krishnamurti was known to be able to, I don't really like this term, but to heal. It's not something that he talked about. It's not something that was part of his life. And it's not something I ever talked to Vanda about because, you know, she knew I was doing, you know, biomedical research, but hadn't really gotten into biofield therapies. Here's the young David Bohm speaking with Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein, this very famous quote, having trouble with this concept of quantum physics and quantum mechanics and concepts of entanglement, because it just didn't fit the model of space and time and cause and effect. And as he said, spooky action at a distance, where two entangled subatomic particles on different parts of the planet and theoretically in different parts of the universe can instantaneously be connected with each other. And you do something to one particle, the other particle instantaneously registers it. It didn't make sense to Einstein. Since then, through the work of Leonard Susskind and others, that there is this clear connection. And what's interesting about Suskind's work is that he's trying to connect it with gravity, trying to create this universal theory that will bring together some of the concepts from Einstein's work with quantum mechanics and entanglement. And as he says here, they're literally inseparable. And he goes on and says in this article that you see referenced there, that he hopes that someday that through computer algorithms that we're going to be able to show that this phenomena is actually happening. And those of you who pay attention to the Nobel Prize literature will know that the Nobel Prize in Physics just this year was for this entangled research, for quantum communication through computers. And I won't read the quote at the bottom there. You can read it, and it is mind-boggling that this is something that has now been documented. Two particles behave like a single unit when they are separated. You know, think about what that means from, I'll take it to this other side, which obviously they don't talk about in physics, but from a consciousness perspective, because what are we? We are particles, and we are made up of the same particles, of course, that created the universe. So let's talk a little bit about biofield, and we'll see how long I'm allowed to stay on the stage. So the biofield in itself is not controversial. There are known ways of measuring bioelectromagnetic energy of our body. And this is through things like EEG and the EKG. And we are bioelectrical beings, more electrical actually than bio and electromagnetic. Where things, you know, go a little off the stage, so to speak, is that when we start talking about these putative subtle energies from our Eastern traditions, things like ki or chi, or from the Indian tradition, prana, the energetic force of the body, the gravity, let's say, that Vanda was feeling and really tapping into. Now, you know, we may think this is controversial, but if we look at the literature and what's going on with EMF, it is not controversial. This is becoming the standard of care, and specifically in cancer, Novocure, alternating electromagnetic fields, is an FDA-approved device for remittent GBM, and they're looking at other cancers. In conventional cancer medicine and other diseases, we are using electromagnetic fields to treat diseases. A colleague who is collaborating with Dr. Yang and myself, Mike Levine at Tufts, is doing research on the electrical potential of cells. And he has shown that if you take a normal melanocyte and you energetically separate it from its surrounding cells, it will become a melanoma. So he's taken a healthy cell. He hasn't changed its DNA. He hasn't hit it with radiation. He separates it from its cohort and it starts misbehaving. That, to me, is phenomenal. And that's the kind of research that could really make a difference, going beyond just the biology and starting to look at the energetic connection that exists within cancer. So the internal practices I've talked about, and these are well known, and we know that they work, and we, you know, because it's easy to measure, reduce it to the biomedical model, biobehavioral processes of why these interventions are so useful. But then there's the external. And this, of course, is the lightning rod of alternative medicine and quackery, you know, waving your hands over somebody and that's going to heal them. And you know, we're told that these practitioners can do it at a distance. That's even crazier. I don't think that Leonard Susskind would think that's crazy. And Einstein, if he were alive today, probably wouldn't think it's crazy either, because some atomic particles can be connected at a distance. So why can't that potentially be true of human beings? So we started work in this area. I was introduced to Sean Harabance, and I can't go into too much detail about him because I don't have enough time, but those of you who are interested, he was, you know, technically a clairvoyant. He didn't know that he had these healing abilities and the concept of biofield and photon emissions. He has been studied for 50 years of his life, first at Duke, and he was part of Stargate, which was funded by the Department of Defense to be able to do remote viewing. An interesting side note is that Stargate, they say, never led to any meaningful discoveries. yet it was funded in the multi-millions of dollars for more than 20 years. Really? There was nothing there, and you kept funneling millions of dollars to clairvoyance, and you didn't find anything? That is very questionable. He's been studied in terms of biophoton emissions from his body and his EEG, and all this was done prior to us meeting him. He also had this very unique ability of being able to diagnose illnesses in people who didn't even know them. And if you buy me a strong cup of green tea, I will share the story of how he diagnosed my cancer before I knew I had it. And within 48 hours, we both knew that he was right. So we embarked on this research to be able to look at both in vitro as well as in vivo studies, bringing this into the lab. I was so thankful that Dr. Peiying Yang, who many of you know, was brave enough to own this research. She continues this extremely challenging research today, and I'll show you some of the data. So our initial work was just with cells, with cancer cells. You see on the left, these are human lung cancer, and then mouse lung cancer on the right, which we continued to work with in the animal models. But there was this clear effect. There was a decrease between the experimental and the control. If you look at apoptosis and the cells that are stained, you don't really need to see a bar graph to see that there's a lot fewer cancer cells in that bottom panel. Peiying took this further and started to look, of course, at specific cancer pathways, in this case, expression of phosphorylated AKT. And AKT is linked with invasion and metastasis, to key cancer hallmarks that ultimately leads to mortality in cancer. So what happened in the animals? All injected with the same amount of Lewis lung tumor cells. You see here two experiments that were done. Once the tumors were essentially measurable, the treatment started. The mice were randomized blindly to have the same tumor size to the two different groups. And although it didn't stop cancer growth, it's clearly slower cancer growth in the treatment group. And we can quantify this. You see pictured here both tumor weight and tumor volume, smaller tumors and smaller tumors. Decreases in the tumor microenvironment, phosphorylated S6. The mTOR pathway is a pathway that drug companies are really trying to target. And to date, I don't think that there's an mTOR inhibitor that isn't toxic enough to make it out of a phase 1 clinical trial. So very interesting to see this marker decreased. What was really surprising is in the change in PD-L1, and those of you who were aware, of course, of the pioneering work of Jim Allison and others in immunotherapy know that targeting PD-L1 is a critical pathway to be able to decrease the ability of the tumor cell to cloak itself from the immune system. IL-6 was lower, MPC1 was lower, chemokines that, of course, are both relevant in the area of inflammation. And other aspects of immune modification, and here again, we're talking about the tumor microenvironment, twofold increase in CD8 cytotoxic T cells, and an 84% reduction in Tregs. Tregs infiltrating the tumor microenvironment make it more hospitable to cancer growth. And here we see what I alluded to earlier, a decrease in infiltrating macrophages in the tumor microenvironment. We know that macrophages drive this process. Interesting work back to sympathetic nervous system activation. We also see that with chronic stress, there's an infiltration of CD8 positive cells. So we did a second study with Sean, and we didn't replicate the first finding of the trajectory of tumor weight and tumor size. But when we looked at the actual tumors, there was a significant difference in necrosis. So although the tumors were of similar size, you can see here that on average, there was much higher necrosis in the animals that were treated with the biofield therapy. There was an increase also in caspase-3, which again is associated with apoptosis, which is going to lead to the necrosis. Same story with the CD8 6 cells. So CD68 infiltrating the tumor microenvironment less if the animals were exposed to biofield. And then something that really surprised us was this decrease in this stem cell marker. Now, those of you who know the stem cell theory of cancer, we're really good, certainly with chemotherapy, at killing the primary tumor, but most current chemotherapies don't kill the stem cells. And if the stem cells remain, then, you know, a year, 2 years, even 10 years later, that's what ultimately will seed and lead to metastasis. Now, I didn't believe any of this stuff going into it. So I was the control person, and we were criticized for the fact that, you know, well, Cohen, you know, is a yoga practitioner, and I would never claim I have, you know, any of these energetic forces. But, you know, they said that that's not the perfect control. But I wanted to literally see this with my own eyes. I wanted to make sure there wasn't anything going on, sleight of hand. And I was in the room and I mimicked Sean's behaviors, was same distance, and so there was heat. I made sure he wasn't wearing something, and, you know, everything that I could control. And very early on, I noticed something very different between my mice that you see pictured here, that you've been looking at, these very active, happy, running around, curious, exploring, and Sean's mice. And this is just a snapshot in time. But this was really, really, really consistent over multiple experiments and multiple, you know, bringing the animals into the room. You know, again, this was just observational, but in the second study, we quantified it and clearly showed that the animals that were being treated were behaving differently. So, you know, in the summary, in the publication, we originally wrote, the animals are somehow conscious of something different in the environment. Keith Block, editor-in-chief of ICT, is like, we can't say that word. We're willing to say the animals were calmer because here they were moving less, so they were calmer. But there was clearly something going on. It's hard to know exactly what was going on. Before moving into the last few minutes of my talk, I just have to acknowledge Pei Ying. I don't know where you are. It's unbelievable what you have been doing. And I thank you, and it's just, it's incredible, this work that I've presented now, but you haven't seen anything yet. And we were very lucky to be funded by the Emerald Gate Foundation, that is very interested in consciousness research, and have allowed us to take this to a whole different level, and to be able to not only replicate with different therapists the exact same phenomena, but we've been able to, over the past year and a half, go deeper into the mechanisms. We're about to start a study this fall to be able to measure aspects of entanglement. And, you know, I'd never heard of the Bell inequality until we added this quantum physicist to our team. And then, you know, the Nobel Prize was won for being able to show that quantum entanglement was defying Bell inequality. We've established an experiment that will theoretically test that. And ultimately, you know, we need to progress to clinical trials and scalability. Is there the potential to learn from this? What is going on? And to create a device. Now, getting to this point was really, really hard, and probably some of the hardest things that Dr. Yang and I have done in our career. And at one point kind of questioning, are we, are we about to sabotage our very successful careers to date? We had to not only establish an internal advisory committee to oversee this research, but then after accumulating a year and a half of research, the institution required us to form an external peer review and to put together the application the foundation had agreed to fund and have it put together like a grant and have it externally peer reviewed by members of MD Anderson's external advisory board, chairs of departments of cell biology, of biochemistry, former president of ASCO, former president of AACR, reviewed all of this data and gave us the green light to continue, which was amazing. So here's an example of what we were doing. Certainly, we had no intention of doing distant treatment to begin with, but COVID forced us to start in the area of distant treatment. And you can see on the lab bench, the just crazy amount of work that Pei Ying and her lab have been doing over these past years, manipulating all of these Petri dishes. And here you see one of the therapists hooked up to an EEG. I would love to be able to show you some of this data, but it's not published yet. Pei Ying presented an abstract at AACR earlier last year, so you can probably look that up. But I thought I could give you just a really quick snapshot. And how many in the room play this online game called Moviedle? Nobody knows how about Wordle? Anyone doing Wordle? Okay, so now you got to do Moviedle, which is you see a really short clip of a movie and you have to guess what that movie is. Okay, so who saw it? So we have some Matrix fans here. When the movies are more obscure, it's a little harder to see. So I thought I could do that same thing with our data. Now, I know there's people online and this is being recorded, and my son said, you can't do that because they're going to be able to freeze it and look at your data. So that actually wasn't our data. That was data from a really important paper that I was part of that was published in Science last December, showing the critical importance of fiber from the diet in increasing response to immunotherapy. That Dr. McQuaid presented some of that data at a past SAO. So let me just close here with this great quote from William James, the father of psychology. And he says, when a thing is new, people will say it's not true. Later, when its truth becomes obvious, they say it's not important. I think with biofield, we're kind of here because, we got some comments that said, well, what about scalability? And yeah, your data shows that this happened, but so what? And it's like, really? So what? A human being doing this shouldn't happen. Like, let's just focus on that basic science concept. And then finally, when it's important, cannot be denied, they say, well, anyway, it's not new. So let me close with this quote back to David Bohm, which, back to consciousness. And he says, deep down, the consciousness of mankind is one. This is a virtual certainty because even in the vacuum, matter is one. And if we don't see this, it's because we are blinding ourselves to it. Now, preparing for this talk a number of weeks ago, I was outlining it while I was on a hike with little Rosie that you see pictured here. And when I reached the top of the mountain, the talk was outlined. And I looked down at the ground and there was this little fire ring created. And there was a rock that had been inscribed. And on the rock, it said, quando ti accorgi che stai guardando lontano, guarda ancora più lontano. When you realize you are looking far, look even further. Thank you. Any questions? Please don't ask me about quantum physics or string theory.
Hi there. I'm over on your left. Oh,
Please.
hi. I'm Cynthia Wu. I'm a neuro-oncologist from Memorial Sloan Kettering. This is my first Society for Integrative Oncology conference, and it's been mind-blowing, everything I've been hearing, since this is all new to me. Your talk is especially mind-blowing. But I want to kind of bring it back. I have two questions and kind of bringing it back to fundamental scientific principles. One is mechanism and one is measurable output. So in terms of mechanism, I'm even going to take a step back and just ask about method. So when Sean is there looking at the rats or mice, what is he doing? Like, what does he think he's doing, right? And corollary to that, is every psychic equivalent? You know, how do you measure, how do you establish like the threshold of good psychic ability to influence these biological processes? And then my second question is, when we're talking about consciousness, this is a little bit earlier on in your talk, and we're talking about consciousness, and we're talking about not just brain function and measurable biological, information we can see, but how people feel, how interconnected, how open-hearted. How do we measure that? Like, if you have a modality where you think that you're helping bring people together and helping create some sort of peace, love, understanding, respect kind of force, like how do we measure that and show it as an evidence-based reality?
So extremely good questions, and I will reflect it back and say we need to do this, that we need to be able to measure this. One of the limitations to date in all of our research, and I would say anyone doing the biofield research, is measuring what is happening. Quantifying the abilities of somebody, that's what we're trying to do now, and we're quantifying it based on the output, meaning is the cell migration studies showing less migration. But the question is what is happening? And one way to do that is to block things like EMF. You can put the Petri dishes in a Faraday cage or wrap them in tinfoil, which is even a better way of blocking EMF. Does the effect go away? Ideally, we're actually measuring something in the environment, and we are hopefully in the next 6 months or so, an individual who does a lot of work in quantum communication funded by the DoD is building a miniature squid-based device to be able to essentially have on the countertop to measure what's going on in the environment from before, during, and after. And ideally, quantifying it, right? If we look at the way that basic biomedicine is done in drug discovery, is there a dose response? Obviously, there's an on and off, but is more better? And what we found in dosing studies actually of this, the more is not better. That there was kind of this sweet spot, and not enough and too much almost negated the effect.
And by dose, do you mean just amount of time that the person is there? And then what is the person like thinking about the tumor cells in the animal? Is that, are there certain instructions, or what are they trying to do, or not, or they are not trying to do?
Yeah, so if there's folks in the room who may know more about this than I do, because I'm more of the reductionistic scientist, let's say. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I am basically a healing touch and Reiki healer, and I can just speak for myself. I mean, I don't think you're thinking about anything. It's kind of it's a sensorial kind of connection. And you can just basically feel a disturbance, and you almost merge your own calmness and consciousness with what you feel. That's kind of what I feel, basically.
And they've shared, that essentially they're opening up, they're opening up the energy and the connection between them and the target, whether that's a person, an animal, the cells, and that they literally have this connection and feel it almost as an energy transfer. So quantum communication is literally information being transferred, and theoretically it's information that is being transferred in both directions. This is highly speculative, but I think it's incumbent upon us as a scientific community to try and answer your questions, and that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. So happy to be here as well. I'm Nisa Maguchi, clinical immunologist and oncologist from Brazil. And some years ago, Suresh Ramalingam from the Emory Hospital, he told me, "Oh, Nisa, we found the epigenetic body." I said, "Wow, so what? What does it mean?" Because in fact, there is something that moves the genes. The closest part of the DNA opens up others and gives the directions for differentiation or undifferentiation that brings to cancer. So this epigenetic field is something that moves all our genes inside. And that's very close to what you are thinking, because there are proteins, histones, acetylation, disacetylation, but what drives that? So this is part of this answer of what's the magnetic body or something like that. But people are talking about epigenetic body. And the other thing is Rupert Sheldrake does the morphogenetics from plants. And Rupert Sheldrake also did a study on dogs that know their owners will come home. They put both and measure the moment the owner would come home and the dog would go to the window. So I think that we have to move forward with our good friends in epigenetic field, because it's quite the answer to what's going on with etheric body, with our with other things that we can feel, some from us can see, and or almost touch, and there is a meaning for that in the genomics and molecular behavior of the genes. So it's quite amazing. I see many healers in Brazil. We can study them afterwards.
That
Thank
sounds great. Well, thanks for sharing that. There's no question that this it is a multi-pronged approach, and we need to look at, for lack of a better term, all the omics that are going on within the system and outside the system, because it's very easy to go inside, and Dr. Yang's doing this now, knocking down this pathway and enhancing this pathway and seeing what the internal mechanism is, but we need to get to the external mechanism as well.
I was going to say, I'm sorry. My name is Ski Chilton. I'm a hard-ass biochemist and was an unbeliever until I started meditating 6 years ago. And now I know there's something, I just don't know what. My question is kind of a follow-up. Something like metabolomics sits right next to the phenotype. And with transcriptomics, you're a good bit away. Proteomics, you're closer to the phenotype. Metabolomics, you're right on top of the phenotype. So metabolomics combined with network analysis is really a powerful, powerful way. And we've used it in our lab with COVID to understand the lethal mechanism of COVID. And it's really a powerful way to understand the underlying molecular mechanisms that are driving a phenotypic response. And I guess I wonder if you've thought about utilizing, in particular, metabolomic approaches to understand the molecular. It's one thing to measure the biomarkers. The biomarkers,
Yeah.
they go up and down. It's one thing to measure gene transcription goes up and down, and we all do that and we go, yay, yay, yay. But are the 3,600 metabolites in which molecular networks are changing?
Thanks for bringing that up. Dr. Yang is especially interested in metabolomics. So, part of it was the funding, part of it was first showing this they're there. And if we can convince the, past president of AACR that there's a there, we're ready to move forward and do metabolomics. And I think that's queued up later in the year.
I think
Thank
we'll
you.
just have one last question, just to be sensitive to the next panel. And then for the plenary speakers, we'll adjust the schedule a little bit and come back at 9:20 for the plenary talk. It's 9:10 right now.
Hi, my name is Sherry Sampson, and I'm a professor at the University of Missouri in the arts and humanities. I'm also a 5-year survivor of hereditary breast cancer and a member of the Patient Advocacy Committee. And my question is rather a comment on behalf of patients. From a patient's perspective, it's all the more important to have this rigorous institutional research in these fields and these healing modalities, so that there can be practitioners that can guide us through understanding the options and the possibilities of integrative approaches, because it's so easy to consult with Google, and to get incredibly confusing and contradictory, as well as potentially dangerous information, or at the very least, not particularly beneficial. I mean, I used a lot of integrative approaches in my treatment as well. Of course, I also did everything the doctors told me in terms of the conventional treatment as well. But I'm thinking of websites like Truth About Cancer. I find it incredibly confusing to navigate that website with a lot of very unusual, sort of information regarding, what's, cancer and alternatives and so on. So I'm sure people are familiar with that site. I also take a bit of issue with, this is just a personal opinion, but with their, some of their rather conspiratorial ideas and politics as well. So just my comment. So it's very important to have this research, so to help us patients, so that we can, have practitioners that can guide us, that are there in clinical settings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's about serving our patients, revealing what works, what doesn't work, and changing the standard of care. Thank you.